I have built an FPL team of players under 10% owned, and honestly, all of these 15 players need to be on your radar come game week 1 because I think they are offering incredible FPL value and nobody's buying them. So in this video, we will be touching on those players and why you need to consider them. So as always, if you look forward to it, please do consider dropping a like on the video and of course, smashing that subscribe button for daily fantasy content. Enough waffling, let's get into today's video. So the two goalkeepers that I think are being massively overlooked going into game week 1 is going to be Newcastle's Nick Pope and Nottingham Forest's new goalkeeper, Carlos Miguel, who are both ridiculously lowly owned. Carlos Miguel at 2% and Pope at 5%. And that is the one that has really shocked me. So first up, Nick Pope. At 5 million, I've always banged the drum about how 4.5 million goalkeepers are the way to play the game. But we've actually now a bit of a limited selection with Robert Sanchez now being a huge rotation risk, injury to Verbruggen and some difficult fixtures for other 4.5 million options. I am starting to consider whether a 5 million option in Nick Pope is actually the direction to go for now. I'll put the fixtures up for Newcastle in the opening 6 game weeks, and as you can see, they are a little bit mixed, but the opening 3 in particular for Newcastle are quite favourable. Southampton at home, Bournemouth away, Spurs at home, and I'd even argue 2 teams away from home, Wolves and Fulham in game weeks 4 and 5. I wouldn't necessarily say they are free-flowing goal-scoring teams, so I wouldn't even be surprised if Newcastle were to pick up maybe 1 clean sheet over that period too. I think the reason why his ownership is so low right now is because a lot of managers are going towards the Newcastle defenders at 4.5 million. And I do agree that at 4.5 million, the Newcastle defenders do offer great value, but I don't actually think we can confidently sit here right now and say who the best Newcastle defender to go for is. I think Livramento is brilliant if Trippier does get a move to Saudi. And likewise, Lewis Hall, he looks like he could be starting for Newcastle, but at the same time could be a major rotation risk with somebody like a Dan Burn. And for me, Dan Burn just doesn't really excite me as an FPL option. So by default, I actually think Nick Pope is an incredible value pick at 5 million for you to get those opening fixtures, especially if you are planning on using a wildcard, maybe around game week 4 or 5. Then Nick Pope looks brilliant, especially with the likes of save points that he's accumulated in his time in the FPL game, like in Newcastle and Burnley. Now, the other goalkeeper that a lot of managers are not even considering is going to be Forest new keeper Carlos Miguel, 2% owned, and he does fall into that 4.5 million price bracket. Now, again, I'll put the long-term fixtures up for Nottingham Forest, but in particular, those opening 3 are fantastic. Bournemouth at home, followed by Southampton away and Wolves at home. I really believe that once we see Carlos Miguel in pre-season for Nottingham Forest, he is going to be on everybody's radar. But I totally understand why managers haven't gone there yet because, of course, we haven't actually seen him in a Nottingham Forest shirt, having been only signed last week. But I think with him being 6'8", Nottingham Forest had a few set-piece issues last season. I think they've probably bought him to actually come in as their number 1. But of course, it is worth noting there are some rumours going around of potentially Ramsdale moving to Nottingham Forest. So that will kind of get rid of Carlos Miguel as an option if that does happen. But at the time of recording, Miguel has to be on your radar at 4.5 million. And with that ownership, he could be incredible come game week 1. So take a look at some of those defenders that are being massively overlooked, and I'm really surprised at some of these names being under 10% owned. So first up, we got Robertson coming in at 6 million, only 6% owned in the game. People are naturally being drawn towards Trent, who is 1 million more at 7 million. But of course, with Liverpool in general, we don't really know exactly what we're getting from this Arne Slot team. Are the defenders going to be attacking fullbacks? Are we going to see more controllers in this team? Maybe someone like an inverted fullback like Trent, which means Robertson's going to bomb on down the wing. We haven't really got those answers right now. And it's 6 million. Robertson being with the pre-season squad, but of course having a slight injury right now. We do think he'll be okay for game week 1. I do think Robertson is a brilliant option for our teams, being 1 million cheaper than someone like a Trent. The thing that I will state is this: all Liverpool players are a little bit of a risk in themselves because we don't really know what we are getting with them going into game week 1 with Arne Slot as manager. But I think if you don't want to take the risk with Trent at 7 million, the fixtures for Liverpool are so good. Away against Ipswich, home against Brentford. United away in game week 3 isn't ideal, but then Forest and Bournemouth at home in game weeks 4 and 5. It does feel like you want a piece of that Liverpool defence at some sort of level. And I do think Robertson at 6 million maybe is the safer pick than spending that extra 1 million on someone like Trent. We would look at the underlying numbers last season of Robertson, but again, very difficult to come to any conclusions when we know it's going to be a completely different manager and maybe system that is being played compared to last season. Now, one thing that we are clear of is that Crystal Palace's Munoz is going to be an attacking fullback regardless. I'll put up the touch heat map of him last season, and of course he only played 1,400 minutes coming into the team at the second half of the season under Glazner, but we saw some really promising things from Daniel Munoz, and he's only 4% owned right now, so 0.08 XG and 0.16 expected assists. So decent underlying numbers, and also shots in the box at 0.5. You can see he is actually getting into the box at times with this Crystal Palace team. Now, will Glazner go for the same wing-back system with the absence of Mateta and obviously Elise? Who knows? But if we do see promising things in pre-season, I think Munoz at 5 million justifies himself being 0.5 million more than the likes of Anderson. And if you can squeeze up to a Crystal Palace wing-back in Munoz, I think it's a brilliant option. The only thing that I will say is Palace is opening fixtures with Brentford away in game week 1, Chelsea away in game week 3, United at home in game week 5. I don't see loads of clean sheets for Palace, so then you might be reliant quite a bit on his attacking returns. But I've seen Anderson highly owned right now, so I think to myself, if you're going for Anderson for clean sheets, I'd rather just pay a little bit more and get yourself at least some potential attacking returns. Now, next up, a player that is definitely a risk, but I do think his ownership is going to skyrocket very soon, is going to be Lewis Hall. We spoke about Newcastle's defenders at 4.5 million. I am certain one of Lewis Hall or Livramento is going to emerge as an FPL option this season. Both playing limited minutes last year, but Eddie Howe was trusting on his experienced players in Burn and Trippier. I can't see Eddie Howe rolling out those two again this season. I think there will be some sort of evolution in this Newcastle team. And my money's on Lewis Hall right now. He is a phenomenal player. This is a potential England left back in this Newcastle team. He's had a brilliant pre-season, really going well in this Eddie Howe team. And as I mentioned, 4.5 million, 1% owned. And those opening 3 fixtures against Southampton, Bournemouth and Spurs are really, really favourable. Again, if we have no clarification, he is actually going to play, then this is an avoid. But the early signs we've seen in pre-season are promising. And if we do not want to be spending that 5 million on Nick Pope, I do think 4.5 million for Lewis Hall, if we get those guarantees, is absolute FPL gold. Now, last 2 players we need to cover off. Robinson at Fulham, an attacking fullback that we did see in last season's fixtures, 5% owned right now. I really think he's a good 4.5 million option for Fulham if you can rotate him well with another option. United away in game week 1 is not ideal, but following that, with Leicester at home, Ipswich away, West Ham at home, some really nice fixtures along the way. The one thing I will say about Fulham is a little bit of uncertainty with Paulinho going. Is that going to negatively impact them defensively? You probably would argue yes, but I still think Robinson is a great alternative to some of those centre-back options that people are selecting. He is going to give you at least some potential attacking returns for Fulham with 6 assists last year. And I do like the fixtures from an attacking perspective, especially against Leicester and Ipswich. So make sure you have Robinson on your radar. I'm very surprised he's only 5% owned in the game right now. And lastly, a player that is definitely getting more and more appeal is going to be Brighton's Barco at 7% owned. Now, my prediction is that this will be doubled come game week 1, because with the injury to Estupiñán, who looks like he could be out until potentially September or October, Barco is getting the minutes in pre-season on set pieces, and he's only 4 million. The only thing that is putting off managers, of course, is the opening fixtures of Brighton. Away against Everton, Man United at home, Arsenal away. But game weeks 4 and 5 against Ipswich and Forest, I think is enough of a reason for you to have Barco in your team. Because if he does get any sort of attacking return in those opening fixtures, I could see his price skyrocketing even with tricky fixtures coming up. And I think you want to be early on that train, because I could see it leaving the station very, very early on. So those are the defenders right now. let's move into the midfielders. So take a look at the midfielders, and this is where it is getting quite exciting. It's some of the ownerships of these brilliant value picks. And I really believe between 5.5 million and 7 million, there are some incredible options that are being massively overlooked by FPL managers. And I would honestly argue that if you wanted to, you could honestly roll out a midfield like this and you would do perfectly fine from game week 1. I don't think we have to spend that mega money on those premiums in the game. So first up, a player that is absolutely on my radar come game week 1 is going to be Brennan Johnson. Now, I need to firstly say, if you're in a position where you're going to be wildcarding in game week 4, that I know a lot of managers are doing, you have to have this man on your radar. He's played solid minutes in pre-season. 6.5 million is unbelievable value, especially if you can't be getting yourself to the 10 million that Son is giving us. With the opening fixtures against Leicester and Everton, yes, game week 3 isn't great against Newcastle, but I also would say the pace in this Spurs team definitely could cause problems to Newcastle away from home. So I really do think the opening 2 against Leicester and Everton are fixtures to target for these Spurs assets. And I think Johnson is a great pick. So what I'm going to do here is put up the underlying numbers for Johnson, Martinelli, Grealish and Szoboszlai. It's just a bit of a reference point for us as we talk through the midfielders. Of course, we haven't got any information on Minter at Brighton, but we will come on to him in a minute. But for me, Johnson has to be a consideration for your teams. But if you're not planning to wildcard until maybe game week 6 or beyond, the fixtures get a little bit more difficult from game week 3 onwards. And then maybe holding Johnson in your team might be a difficult task. So one to monitor if you are wildcarding early on like myself. Next up is going to be Martinelli, and it's worth noting, in terms of Johnson, those numbers are really solid. 0.4 XG per 90, 0.28 expected assists per 90. Those are fantastic numbers and one to monitor. So coming into Martinelli, a really disappointing season last year. We saw what he could do in previous seasons where he got 15 goals in one calendar season, but we didn't see that man last year, even though he did play a lot of minutes, over 2,000 minutes for Arsenal, but an XG per 90 of 0.31, expected assists of 0.22. I think the underlying numbers are actually okay considering his output was so terrible. And I do think Arsenal had a problem with their left side. Left back was always an issue. Left sided centre mid was always an issue. And Martinelli is one of those players very different to Saka. Saka can create his own moments. He can basically get the ball in any position. And he had all those connections around him in Odegaard and Ben White. Martinelli basically was on his own last season. And he's definitely a player that requires service. And I think with Calafiori coming into this Arsenal team, that is the first step of Arteta resolving that issue. And I wouldn't be surprised if Martinelli starts the season with a bang. Game week 1 against Wolves is brilliant. Game week 3 is great. And even away against Aston Villa in game week 2, that feels like a Martinelli fixture where he can get beyond that high line. And I think it's 7 million. This is a player that's getting massively overlooked. I understand Odegaard is a player that is more popular because at 8.5 we know exactly what we're getting with Odegaard. But if you're looking for maybe a wild card early and a bit of a punt, I think Martinelli is a phenomenal option, but I get it if you're worried about rotation with Trossard. Coming into Jack Grealish, another player who had an incredibly disappointing season last year, only played about 1,000 minutes, which is really poor, and his underlying numbers also weren't great. 0.19 XG, 0.23 expected assist. Really not that attractive underlying numbers, and of course the minutes rotation is a big problem with him. But if you're in a position right now where you are looking to have a piece of the Man City attack, you can't afford HAALAND because you just can't justify the price. And the recent quotes from Pep suggesting that Foden might not be back until game weeks 1 or game weeks 2, maybe Jack Grealish is the answer. He's had good minutes in pre-season, scoring again last night against Barcelona. So with 6.5 million, he is actually offering brilliant FPL value for our teams. And I do think if you are scared of not having any Man City attack, maybe Grealish is the route to go for right now. Finally, the other player on our stats right now is going to be Szoboszlai. 0.14 expected goals per 90 last season, 0.24. I actually think he can do so much better than these numbers. Klopp was basically playing him as Jordan Henderson last season. I think Arne Slot is going to play him more as a false 9 or a number 10. And that naturally is going to see his numbers absolutely fly through the roof. And I think it's 6.5 million. Similar to Grealish. Can Grealish cover HAALAND? No. Can Szoboszlai cover Mo Salah? Absolutely not. But at half the price of that player, does he pose brilliant FPL value? And I think the answer is yes, especially in those opening fixtures away against Ipswich, Brentford and United. If you actually think they're more difficult than what they are, and I think they actually probably are more difficult than what they look on paper, maybe just spending that little bit less, getting a piece of that attack in Szoboszlai, who we know is going to have guaranteed minutes, is actually the route to go for. And I currently have Szoboszlai in my team as a 6.5 million midfielder. Finally, Brighton's Minter, who we don't have any underlying numbers for, so it's worth noting we are actually just taking a bit of a punt on him. But 1% owned. Talk about a player who has actually impressed us in pre-season. He has been phenomenal, playing off that right-hand side. Now, Brighton's opening fixtures are not great. Everton away, followed by Man United and Arsenal. But if you did want to take a punt in the opening weeks, maybe a bandwagon whose price is going to skyrocket, I think it could be Minter. I've seen a few managers talk about him, but are a little bit too scared to put him in their teams. And at 5.5 million, I do think Hudson-Odoi is probably the more wise move because the fixtures are better, and I'd argue his minutes are as good as Minter's. But I think you need to have him on your radar regardless, because I think this is a player whose price could skyrocket if we see the new manager put some trust in him as his boy. But let me know your thoughts in the comments on these midfielders. I think they'll all be massively overlooked. Finally, coming into the forwards, and of course, a lot of the premium players, Haaland, Watkins, Havertz, Isak, are all highly owned in the game. So when we're looking at players under 10% owned, they are naturally going to be these cheaper alternatives. But I'm actually quite surprised at how lowly owned these three are. So we have Nottingham Forest Chris Wood, we have Fulham's Muniz, and we have Southampton's Armstrong. So first up, Chris Wood. We know that he was fantastic at the back end of last season. 14 goals. His expected goals were brilliant as well. And we look at the fixtures for Nottingham Forest in the opening weeks. Bournemouth at home, Southampton away, Wolves at home. Yes, game weeks 4 to 5 are not ideal against Liverpool and Brighton, but I really do think that Wood is a consideration for our teams. Now, I think the big deliberation right now is Hudson-Odoi better at 5.5 as a midfielder, or Chris Wood at 6 million as a forward? And I think I have a bit more confidence over Chris Wood than Hudson-Odoi. Hudson-Odoi only put up about 2.5 XG last season and scored 8 goals from it. So yes, he is incredible at that kind of cutting in finish, but is that going to actually be consistently happening this season? I don't know if it will do. Whereas Chris Wood's underlying numbers were much more consistent, and that's something I actually think could be replicated going into this season with those opening fixtures. And at 5% owned, I think I could see that price going up a little bit. The only issue about him is, of course, Iwobi, whether he's going to be match fit, because he's also a brilliant alternative to Chris Wood. And then we could see the minutes halved, which would be a concern for Chris Wood. So one to monitor during pre-season. Muniz of Fulham is the one that is catching a lot of managers' attention, but because he kicks off away against Man United in the first game, it's not ideal. However, if you can look longer term, Leicester, Ipswich, West Ham, Newcastle, Forest are brilliant long-term fixtures. I think if you're in a position where you're looking to wildcard a bit later on in the season, this is your better option over Chris Wood. I think the fixtures are better long-term, the underlying numbers are good. I think his minutes are probably as good as Chris Wood's, if not better. And also I think with Fulham, it's a team that always are just consistent under Silva. They know how to get the job done, and I do think Muniz is a brilliant option for our teams. I haven't considered him myself, but he is definitely now on the radar after looking at those long-term fixtures. And finally, it is going to be Southampton's Armstrong. Always a risk going for a promoted team's forward, but 4% owned, Talisman, 5.5 million. If you're in a position right now where maybe you've got HAALAND and another expensive forward, maybe going for Armstrong as your third forward who can rotate with a midfielder in your team is the route to go for. Southampton have mixed fixtures, but when I'm looking at someone to rotate in and out of the starting 11, I think he actually ticks a lot of the boxes. Game week 2 at home against Forest is good. Game week 5 at home against Ipswich is great. So if you can just put him on your bench for the other fixtures and have a good fifth midfielder, I think he's a brilliant rotational forward. And at 5.5 million, you're not spending tons on a player who you're concerned about being on your bench at particular weeks. So that is going to be the 15 players I think it'll be a massively overlooked going into game week 1. And I personally think if we were to come back to this in 2 weeks' time, a lot of these percentages are going to be above 10%. I think they are that good of options. So let me know in the comment section what your thoughts on these players are. Yes, guys, okay, that is going to wrap up today's video looking at the most overlooked players in the game. All of those were below 10% ownership, and as I mentioned, I do think a lot of them could actually skyrocket in the opening weeks. Let me know if I missed any players in the comment section. I'll be really interested to know which player is being lowly owned that you are considering for your FPL teams. And as always, if you did enjoy the video, please do drop a like and smash the subscribe button for daily fantasy content. Have an amazing day. We'll talk real soon. Take care. Cheers.